Hello, this is lecture number 6. This is on basic concepts in the genetics of behavior. Hello, this is lecture number 6. This is on basic concepts in the genetics of behavior. And one of the important things that we're going to be talking about in this relatively short lecture is a concept that I think is critical for your understanding of this area, and that's the whole concept of what's called the reaction range concept. I think it will help you to understand the contribution of genes and environment to behavior. So we're going to be talking about that as we go along. Um, when we talk about genetics, evolution, and behavior, there's three areas that we can explore. One is the whole area of what we call evolutionary psychology, in which we're trying to really understand those important Darwinian principles of natural selection. And what we mean by that is that there are some behavioral tendencies that are favored, and those tendencies that lead to advancing one's genes become very important. So that's the field of what we call evolutionary psychology, which is something that has really grown tremendously in the last 30 years and is now considered to be such an essential part of the field of behavioral neuroscience. We also talk about behavior genetics, in which we're trying to understand really the limits of genetic and environmental influences on behavior. And then we also talk about issues of heritability. And by that, what we mean is, can we really assign a particular percentage, for example, to genetic contribution to behavior? In other words, is it 30%? Is it 40% for a particular behavioral trait? Is it, let's say, 60% environment and 40% genes? So this issue of heritability then is an important one to the extent that we want to try to quantify the degree to which the variation that we see in a particular behavioral trait is due to genes. So those are, important things, important concepts that we talk about in the field of genetics and behavior. Um, so clearly, both genes and environment are playing an important role in shaping human behavior. That is, without question. But really, the issue that is most important is how much of a role genetics play in shaping human behavior. When we explore things like psychological disorders, for example, when we explore things like weight gain, when we explore the different dimensions of personality, sexual orientation, are these behavioral attributes ones that we can say have a definite genetic contribution? The danger in a lot of this has always been the extreme views. For example, that all of our behavior is genetic, or that all of our behavior is really a product of the environment. So again, it's these extremes that have always led to problems and to controversies. Um, Many of you may already be aware of the tremendous controversy that exists in terms of the contribution of genes to intelligence. That's something that you probably discussed in introductory, or should have discussed in an introductory psychology course. So, these are hot button issues. And Darwinian evolutionary theory is important for understanding those things. And the twin research that has been done in the area called concordance is also crucial. We'll be talking about those things as we go along. So really, I think that for most individuals, most scientists anyway, who look upon the contribution of genes to behavior, there's this realization that it's both, that there's an important genetic component and that there's an important environmental component. So that being said, I want to take a look at this concept that we call the reaction range concept, and it's really one that has been borrowed from the field of biology. And I think that is quite simple for students to understand. And again, I'm going to give you an example of this reaction range concept in just a moment as it may pertain to intelligence. But we talk about phenotype, which can be behavior or can be some kind of a physical characteristic, that an individual can exist with a very high level of that particular phenotype or a very low level of that particular phenotype or somewhere in between. When we take a look at the actual genetic underpinnings of that particular phenotype, whether it's behavior or it's some kind of a physical characteristic, we can also exist with a high level of that particular underlying genetic contribution or a relatively low level or somewhere in between. But it's really the environment that we're exposed to that is going to determine the extent to which this genetic potential is realized. So this reaction range concept is saying this. Genes certainly are setting the limits for a particular behavioral trait, but the environment is going to determine if those limits are actually going to be reached, the extent to which those behavioral traits are actually going to be fully expressed or not. So again, this is what's called the reaction range concept. Genes are setting the limits for a behavioral trait. The environment is determining whether or not those limits are actually going to be reached. I think a really productive way of trying to understand that particular theory a little bit better is to give you an actual example. And this is one that I like to use and apply it to the whole area of the intelligence quotient. What you see here is a hypothetical. We have along this axis right here IQ scores. And you've all taken classes in introductory psychology and you know a little bit about IQ. IQ scores is a product of mental age and chronological age, and that 100 is the average. For individuals, most individuals typically are scoring, the bulk of individuals are scoring between 85 and 115. It's more unusual for individuals to score at the extremes, which would be very low or very high. So we say that IQ is something that is normally distributed, with most individuals around the average, and in this case 100 is the average. So now what we're going to do to add to this is we're going to take a look at the quality of the environment that an individual is exposed to. Again, that environment can be one that's very enriched. It can be a relatively average environment, or it can be a deprived environment. And what we're going to do is we're going to take hypothetical individuals in each one of these environments. And we're going to take a look at what their actual measured IQ is by measuring by way of standardized intelligence tests, things like the Stanford-Binet test, for example, or the Wechsler test. And what we're going to be doing is we're then going to speculate about what happens in terms of the or what is expressed in terms of the inherited reaction range of the individual and where that individual actually scores in terms of their inherited reaction range. So again, let's take a look at this as a product of environment. Let's first deal with an environment that's a relatively deprived one. That's in the green that you see here. We have these three hypothetical individuals, George, Abby, and Teresa. And let's take George. George has an inherited reaction range, which is a hypothetical, okay, that goes from about 65 to 85. And when we actually measure George's IQ with a standardized instrument, a standardized test, what we find is that George scores relatively low. He's scoring 70. That's 30 points below the average. Take a look at Abby. Abby has an inherited reaction range that goes from about 94 to 116. And when we actually measure Abby's IQ, what we see is that she's at the low end of her inherited reaction range. She scores 95. Take a look at Teresa now. Teresa has an inherited reaction range that goes from about 125 to 145. When we actually measure Teresa's IQ, her IQ by measurement from these standard instruments, like the Stanford Binet test, for example, that she scores 130, which again is at the low side of her inherited reaction range. So there's a few things, that you should note here. What you should note is we have a wide array of inherited reaction ranges, some relatively low, some average, and some relatively high. But with each one of these individuals, they are scoring low on their inherited reaction range, right? And of course, they're all in deprived environments. So indeed, this whole notion then that genes are setting the limits, but whether or not we reach those limits is going to be dependent upon the environment. Certainly in this deprived environment, all of these individuals, what they have in common is that they are scoring low in their inherited reaction range. Now let's take an average environment. That's in the blue that you see here. And three individuals, Ping, Bart, and Sylvester. Ping has an inherited reaction range that goes from about 75 to about, let's say, 96, 94, 95. When we actually measure Ping's IQ, he's almost intermediate in his inherited reaction range, but still scores relatively low. What we would call low average, 85. Bart, on the other hand, has an inherited reaction range that goes from, let's say, about 97 to about 117. And when we actually measure Bart's IQ, it's almost midway in his inherited reaction range. He scores 110. When we take a look at Sylvester, Sylvester has a very broad inherited reaction range, which once again, this is all hypothetical, that goes from about, let's say, 113 to 150. Take a look at Sylvester's actual measured IQ. Take a look at it here, and that measured IQ is 125. So what are the common things here? Well, they're all exposed to an average environment. And what we see is that they tend to score midway or close to midway in their inherited reaction range. Okay. Now let's take a look at an enriched environment. We have three individuals here, Suad, Latoya, and Craig. Suad has an inherited reaction range that goes from about 65 to about 87. When we actually measure Suad's IQ, standardized test, he's at the high end of his inherited reaction range. He scores an 85. Take a look at Latoya. Latoya has an inherited reaction range that goes from about 102 to about 130. When we actually measure Latoya's IQ, she's at the high end of her inherited reaction range. She scores 125. Now take a look at Craig. When we explore Craig, what we see is in terms of his inherited reaction range that it goes from about 120, 125 to about 136. And when we actually measure Craig's IQ, standardized test, he's at the high end of his inherited reaction range. He scores 135. So what do we have in common here? What we have in common here is that these three individuals are all in the same kind of environment. They're in an enriched environment. They differ greatly in terms of their inherited reaction range. Take a look at Suad, take a look at Latoya, take a look at Craig. But when we actually measure their IQ with standardized tests, what we see is that they are all at the high end of their inherited reaction range. So again, when we go back to that whole concept of the reaction range concept, genes are setting the limits. But whether or not you reach those limits is very much going to be determined by the kind of environment, the quality of the environment that you are exposed to. So that's a concept that I think is going to keep coming back to us, as we go along. So now we're going to pursue some other elements of evolutionary psychology and give you a basic understanding of some of the principles of Darwinian evolutionary theory.